London, in the late 1800s, had a certain stillness to it at night that could unsettle even the most familiar hearts. Gas lamps flickered along damp cobbled streets, their yellow light casting long shadows that stretched and curled like secrets whispering through the fog. The river, thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp wood, carried the muted hum of a city both alive and unwell. Behind closed doors and drawn curtains, a quiet epidemic was spreading. Not the kind that made headlines with feverish cries, but one that slipped in like a sigh, soft and almost invisible. They called it opium. Some called it a cure, others a curse. For many women of Victorian London, it became something in between, a comfort on sleepless nights, a remedy for pains that doctors could not explain, and for some, a chain they would never break. It often began innocently, a bottle labeled soothing syrup tucked away in the corner of a kitchen cabinet, a little laudanum in a teacup when the headaches refused to fade, or a doctor's kind assurance that a few drops before bed would bring peaceful sleep. The city was a tangle of demands, especially for women. Mothers tending restless children, wives expected to keep perfect homes on modest means, workers in dim factories with aching backs and cold hands. In those cramped rooms and narrow streets, the promise of a few hours of calm felt like a gift. The chemist shops along Whitechapel and Bloomsbury did not hide it. They advertised it. The newspapers printed it. And in those days, few questioned the bittersweet liquid that promised rest. But this is not a tale of medicine alone. It is a story of how something so small, so ordinary, wound its way into the fabric of lives and left behind threads of sorrow, dependence, and whispered regret. Women, those most often trusted to hold families together, became its quiet carriers. A mother who could no longer rise from her bed, a seamstress who missed days of work, a widow who stared at the embers of her hearth long after midnight, lost in a haze both comforting and cold. Behind the heavy drapes of respectable homes and the thin curtains of lodging rooms, opium blurred the line between care and captivity. One winter evening, a young woman named Clara walked home through the fog. Her shawl was thin against the chill, and her hands clutched a small paper packet from a chemist. Inside were a few dark drops that had become part of her evenings. She told herself it was only until spring, only until the coughs stopped and the nights grew easier. Clara was not alone. All across Victorian London, women like her were making the same quiet bargains with themselves, believing they could stop when they wished. Believing the city's growing appetite for this bitter medicine was just a passing season. Yet, whispers were beginning to stir. Doctors noticed patients who came too often. Husbands noticed wives who had once been brisk and bright, now lingering in a slow, clouded calm. Even in parlors and tea rooms, the word opium began to carry a different weight. It was not only the working poor, the weary mothers, or the aging widows. It was also the daughters of merchants, the wives of clerks, the sisters of men who wrote laws and ran banks. The epidemic was polite enough to knock on every door, and quiet enough that no one wished to say how far it had entered. In the shadow of gaslit streets, there were other figures too, chemists who saw the profit, traders who smuggled stronger tinctures, and men in dark coats who carried crates unloaded from ships at the docks. China's sorrow had become London's solace, and the empire's trade routes fed both. The opium dens that poets would later write about were only one part of it. The more common story was simpler, smaller, more domestic. It lived in teacups, spoons, and little brown bottles. What makes this history heavy is not only the numbers, how many bottles sold, how many women swayed between health and haze, but the faces lost in its fog. Women who could not explain why their hearts raced without it. Mothers who wept quietly when their hands trembled too much to thread a needle. Young girls, pale and tired, whose lives are measured not in years, but in how many drops the night required. And yet, the city turned its wheels. The carriages still clattered, the markets still opened, and the newspapers still printed their small, discreet advertisements. Tonight, as you listen, picture that world as it was. Not the grand halls and glittering balls of history books, but the rooms where a single candle flickered low, where a woman sat alone with a bottle that promised to make her world bearable for a few more hours. Picture the cold air slipping through the cracks of a window, the faint echo of hooves on the street outside, and the sound of her sigh as she reached for the dark liquid once more. Did she know what it was doing? Perhaps. Did she believe she could stop? Almost certainly. Did anyone come to warn her? Not yet, because this story does not start with a single law or a single tragedy. It starts with a feeling of exhaustion, of longing for ease, of a city that moved too fast for those who had no choice but to keep pace. It starts with women who were told to be strong and silent, who found, in a bitter tincture, a brief permission to rest. But as the winter turned to spring and spring turned again to winter, some of those women began to disappear from the gatherings they once attended. Letters went unanswered, windows stayed shuttered, and the word opium, once whispered kindly, began to be spoken with unease. Somewhere, a small group of reformers had begun to take notice. A doctor who lost a patient too soon. A journalist who saw the same bottles in too many homes. A sister who wept as her younger siblings' bright eyes dulled. They began to ask questions no one wished to answer. How much was being sold? Who was profiting? And why were so many women, wives, mothers, daughters, falling into this slow, quiet sleep? Clara's footsteps echoed on the cobblestones that night as she neared her door. She paused, looking down at the packet in her hand. The fog swirled, and a carriage rumbled somewhere far off. Inside, her children slept, her husband's boots stood by the fire, and on the table a teacup waited. She told herself it was the last time, or perhaps the second to last. But even she felt, in the pit of her stomach, that the city was changing, that something which had begun with soft promises would not end so gently. And in that stillness, the question hung. Who would speak first? Who would pull aside the curtain and name what was happening while there was still time? Or had time already slipped away like smoke rising from the river, leaving only the echo of what might have been? Morning in Victorian London did not always bring light. Sometimes it only revealed the weight of another day. The fog lifted slowly, clinging to the narrow streets and gray rooftops like a curtain reluctant to open. In a modest house near Clerkenwell, Clara stirred awake, her head heavy and her throat dry. The children were already up, their soft voices carrying through the thin walls. But she lay still for a moment longer, watching the pale light creep across the ceiling. Her hands trembled slightly as she rose, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough that she noticed it herself. She had promised to stop after last night, to be done with the tiny bottle that sat now on her kitchen shelf. And yet, she could already feel the pull of its quiet promise. The city outside was alive with its usual murmur. Carriages rattled past, their wheels splashing through puddles left by the night's mist. Vendors called from the corners, selling bread and matches, while the distant bells marked the hour with a hollow chime. Somewhere along the Strand, chemists were already opening their shutters. The smell of camphor, herbs, and that faint bitter note of laudanum drifting into the streets. It was a smell familiar to many women, even those who had never spoken of it aloud. Clara was not a weak woman, nor was she idle. Her days were filled with work, sewing when the children were at school, mending clothes for neighbors, keeping the household running while her husband labored at the docks. The pain had started months ago, a tightness in her chest that came with the damp air, and the chemist had given her something to soothe the nerves. It had worked beautifully at first. The nights were easier. The cough eased. Her sleep returned. But now, the nights without it felt long and restless, and the days seemed heavier than they once had. In another part of the city, a young reformer named Mr. Hargreaves walked briskly along Fleet Street, a notebook tucked under his arm. He had begun to collect stories, quiet, often whispered, of women like Clara. His sister, once bright and lively, had wasted away in a matter of months, her cheeks hollowing, her hands always cold. The doctors had said she was delicate. The chemist had sold her his best tincture. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, it was too late. Mr. Hargreaves wrote letters to editors, spoke in small meetings, and urged officials to look closer at the bottles that filled so many cupboards. Most nodded politely and said the matter was complicated. After all, opium was not forbidden. It was respectable, medicinal, even recommended by some of the finest physicians. And so the city continued, respectable on the surface, restless underneath. In the West End, ladies sipped their teas, a few drops swirled into the cup for female troubles. In the East End, worn mothers measured out spoonfuls to keep their infant from crying through the night, never knowing how much was too much. It was a quiet epidemic because it did not shout. It whispered. It soothed. And for a long time, it was easier not to ask questions. Clara moved through her morning with the same practiced care as always. Breakfast for the children, a word with her neighbor at the door, a quick glance at the washing that never quite dried in the damp air. The bottle remained on the shelf, untouched for now, but its presence was a weight she carried in her mind. She wondered if her husband had noticed how often she turned to it, or if he thought her simply tired from the season. Men did not ask such things, and women rarely volunteered them. There was a silent understanding in many homes. So long as the house was kept and the children fed, what eased the nights was a private matter. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the streets once again filled with the soft glow of gaslight, Clara found herself at the edge of a decision. Her chest ached, a dull tightness that no warm tea could quite dispel. The children were asleep, their small breaths steady in the next room. Her husband sat by the fire, boots drying, eyes closed in that half-resting way that working men often fell into. She reached for the bottle. Far across the city, Mr. Hargreaves wrote in his notebook by candlelight. The stories were adding up, letters from widows, notes from nurses, clippings from newspapers that rarely made the front page. He wondered how many more winters London would pass before someone listened. There was talk of trade reforms, whispers of moral campaigns, but little that reached the homes where the problem lived. He closed the notebook and blew out the candle, the faint smoke curling upward like the very fog that wrapped the city outside. Meanwhile, in a narrow lane near Whitechapel, a chemist counted his coins and prepared his next shipment. He thought little of the women who bought his bottles. To him, they were customers like any other, and the trade was good. Ships kept coming. Demand kept growing. What harm could a few drops do? He had heard the rumors, of course, but rumors were not regulations, and regulations were not profits. The city slept under its usual veil of mist, but beneath that sleep were the quiet stirrings of change. A handful of doctors debated in smoky rooms. A few reporters sharpened their pens. Women like Clara made private promises to stop, and then, in the silence of the night, broke them again. The epidemic was not yet named as such, but its roots were deepening with every passing week. Clara stared at the bottle in her hand. The fire cracked softly in the grate. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels splashing through a puddle. She thought of her mother, who had warned her once that some remedies cure more than they should. She thought of the children, sleeping soundly, and of the long hours until dawn. The liquid in the bottle glimmered in the light. The question, always, was the same, just for tonight or forever. Would you like me to continue with the next 1,000 words, Part 3, following Clara, Mr. Hargreaves, and the growing whispers in Victorian London? As winter lingered, London's days passed with a strange sameness, gray skies, damp air, the smell of coal always present. Beneath that routine, the city carried countless private battles. Clara was not the only one sitting by a low-burning fire, holding a small glass bottle in the quiet hours when no one else was watching. In a row house 2 streets away, Mrs. Hollings, a widow with 3 young children, rubbed her temples as the day's aches settled into her bones. The chemist's syrup helped her keep going. It calmed her nerves, dulled her grief, and made the heavy hours seem a little lighter. She told herself it was temporary, that once the spring sun returned, she would not need it anymore. Farther west, in a more polished neighborhood near Kensington, Margaret Penwell, once known for her sharp wit and lively conversation, had begun to withdraw. Friends remarked she was tired, perhaps still grieving the child she had lost the previous autumn. They sent flowers and polite notes, but few knew that the bottle of laudanum on her dresser was no longer just for sleepless nights. It had become a quiet companion to her afternoons, the bitter taste, a familiar gateway to a place where her thoughts did not ache so much. And in a cramped lodging house near the docks, young Annie Green, barely 17, counted her coins at the end of each long workday. Her job at the textile factory left her fingers raw and her chest tight with the dust that filled the air. She had found a bottle for cheap, a diluted mixture sold by a man who knew how to stretch a profit. Annie had no children, no husband, no household to manage, yet the same fog began to wrap around her evenings. Her friends noticed her laugh was less frequent, her hands a little slower. They teased her gently at first, then they stopped. The epidemic was not loud. It crept. It settled like the damp in the walls, easy to ignore at first, then harder to shake as the months passed. The bottles were everywhere, on shelves beside respectable medicines, in the baskets of traveling hawkers, in the pockets of sailors who brought stronger tinctures from distant ports. Children were given it to sleep, women took it for pain, men used it after long shifts when the world seemed too heavy. It did not choose only the poor, nor only the wealthy. It did not need to. Mr. Hargreaves, the young reformer, kept collecting his notes. He visited neighborhoods others rarely entered, spoke with women who had little reason to trust men in fine coats with kind smiles. Some told him their stories in whispers, others said nothing at all. He wrote down what he could, the dates, the names, the prices of the bottles. At night, he laid them out across his table, trying to see the shape of the thing. It was there. He could feel it like a shadow just beyond the edge of the candlelight. But still, the city turned its eyes elsewhere. In Parliament, a few questions were raised, quickly drowned by talk of trade and empire. Britain's ships carried opium overseas. Its merchants made fortunes on it. To call it danger at home was to risk more than one kind of profit. So the newspapers printed their small columns, often tucked between advertisements for tonics and teas, and the chemists kept their counters full. Clara's days became a rhythm, one she both feared and relied on. She woke with resolve, worked with care, promised herself each evening would be the last. And yet, as the lamps were lit and the children's whispers faded into sleep, the quiet returned. The quiet was always the hardest part. It was in that stillness that the bottle felt closest, its bitter promise lingering like the damp air outside her door. One cold March night, she stood by her window, watching the street below. The fog was thinner now, spring trying to find its way in, but the city still wore its grayness like a familiar coat. A woman passed with her shawl pulled tight, a child trailing behind her with a small bundle of bread. Across the road, the chemist's window was dark, his shutters drawn for the night. Clara thought of knocking anyway, of asking for one more bottle to keep just in case. She did not that night, but Annie Green did, and Mrs. Hollings did, and Margaret Penwell's maid had already been sent twice that week. The epidemic was no longer just an echo. It was a presence. Yet to most, it still seemed harmless, an unfortunate habit, a passing phase, a private matter behind closed doors. There were whispers of stronger imports arriving at the docks, of dens in Limehouse where smoke curled thick and sweet, but those stories belonged to sailors and poets. The women with their bottles were quieter, gentler, less likely to draw notice. Mr. Hargreaves, frustrated by the indifference he met, began to think of other ways to make the city see. A pamphlet, perhaps. A series of small, truthful stories that might stir someone's conscience. But he needed one voice to open the door, someone respectable enough to be heard, someone brave enough to be named. One evening, he found himself at a gathering in Bloomsbury, a room of reformers and writers, the air thick with pipe smoke and ambition. He spoke of what he had seen, not names, not yet, but patterns. Bottles in every home, women slipping quietly from health to haze. A few heads nodded, others frowned. "It is their choice," said a merchant's wife, sipping her tea, "and some of them truly need it. Who are we to say what is too much?" The room murmured agreement, and the moment passed. Still, Mr. Hargreaves did not give up. And in houses across London, Women like Clara did not sleep easily. The city was moving towards something, though none could yet name it. A line would be drawn, somewhere, between medicine and menace, between comfort and captivity. But for now, the bottles stayed on their shelves, the chemists counted their coins, and the streets kept their fog. The spring of that year arrived hesitantly, as if London itself were unsure whether to shed the cold. The streets grew a little less slick, the days stretched a little longer, and yet the chill clung to the air like an old habit. For Clara, the change in season brought little relief. Her sewing picked up as neighbors prepared for warmer days, and her hands were busy from dawn until the last lamp flickered low. But her mind still wandered in the same familiar circles. Resolutions made in the morning, temptations that pressed close by nightfall. The bottle, no longer full, sat behind a tin of tea on the kitchen shelf. In houses not far from hers, similar rituals played out. Mrs. Hollings sent her eldest to fetch another small bottle from the chemist, claiming it was for the nerves. The boy, barely 8, did not ask questions. Margaret Penwell, in her quieter, grander house, began refusing visitors. Her letters grew shorter, her handwriting shaky. Annie Green, after a long week of factory work, found herself standing again at the dockside stall where the man sold his diluted tinctures, promising they were harmless, just something to ease the chest. The city was full of such moments, scattered like loose threads. They rarely touched one another, yet they were part of the same weave. One damp morning, a small notice appeared in the London Chronicle, tucked between advertisements for patent tonics and a story about railway delays. It spoke of a young mother found collapsed in her chair, her infant crying in the next room. The doctor mentioned a quantity of laudanum discovered on the table beside her. The article was brief, polite, almost forgettable. But for a few who read it, a faint unease settled. One of those readers was Mr. Hargreaves. He clipped the piece and pinned it above his desk. It was not the first, nor the most dramatic, but it was another stone in the pile he had been quietly building. At his small gatherings, he began to share these clippings, laying them out for others to see. "How many more?" he asked softly, though rarely did anyone answer. Meanwhile, the chemist remained busy. Ships came in, bottles went out. The advertisements were gentle, even soothing, for sleepless nights, for the delicate constitution, a friend to mothers and a relief to infants. There were no bold warnings, no dark labels. Why would there be? It was business. It was medicine. It was, for many, still a blessing. Clara's husband, Thomas, began to notice her silences. He would come home from the docks, his shoulders heavy with the day's work, and find her staring at the fire, her needle resting motionless in her lap. She smiled when he asked after her health, said only that she was tired. In truth, she was caught between fear and longing. Fear of what the drops were doing, longing for the quiet they promised. It was a strange thing to depend on something she did not trust. One evening, their neighbor, Mrs. Pratt, came to borrow a spool of thread. Her hands, too, trembled slightly as she accepted the small favor. In the short minutes they spoke, Clara saw in the woman's eyes a familiar shadow, one she had seen in her own reflection more than once. They did not name it. They spoke of the weather instead and the rising price of bread. Across the city, a few voices grew louder, if only by a degree. A letter appeared in the Times from a concerned physician urging greater care in the dispensing of opiate mixtures to the fair sex. It caused a brief stir among his peers and a few sharp remarks from merchants, but the issue soon faded beneath more pressing matters: trade disputes, a royal engagement, a scandal in the colonies. For those living it, the epidemic was not a headline. It was a slow turning of days, a gradual dimming of light behind familiar curtains. And yet, something was shifting. Clara felt it in the way her hands lingered over the bottle now, as though expecting it to accuse her. Mr. Hargreaves felt it in the number of letters that arrived without his asking. Women thanking him quietly for listening, others sharing their stories in fragile handwriting. One rainy afternoon, he found himself outside a shop in Holborn, watching a young girl leave with a small wrapped parcel. She could not have been more than 15. Her shoes were worn thin, her shawl patched at the shoulder. For a moment, he thought to speak to her, to ask what she carried, to warn her perhaps. But the words caught in his throat. What could he offer besides worry? She vanished into the fog, her figure swallowed by the city's indifferent gray. At home, Clara counted her coins. The chemist would not extend her credit again until she paid her small debt. She turned the coins in her palm, their weight both too much and too little. Outside, the bells tolled 6, and the street lamps flickered to life. The city was waiting, though no one quite knew for what. A moment, a name, a reason to say enough. The weeks that followed slipped by quietly, though not without a certain heaviness that hung in the air. Spring stretched further into the streets of Victorian London, and yet the damp chill still lingered in the mornings, curling beneath doors and into the bones of those who rose early to begin their labor. Clara found herself waking before dawn more often now, lying still in the half-light as the city outside stirred to life. Her husband's boots thudded on the worn boards as he prepared for another day at the docks. The children murmured in their sleep, unaware of the clock slowly ticking its steady rhythm in the kitchen. It was during these moments, before the noise and the errands and the work began, that Clara felt the unease most sharply. The bottle on the shelf waited silently, its presence both a comfort and a threat. Beyond her street, London was restless. The city had grown into a maze of contrasts, rich squares lined with polished carriages and narrow lanes filled with soot, smoke, and the hum of too many people. Trade was thriving, ships unloading goods from far-off places, their cargo finding its way into homes both grand and humble. Among the crates and barrels came medicines, herbs, and tonics, small remedies meant to soothe sleepless nights or calm tired nerves. Opium was one of them, and for years it had slipped easily into daily life. It was sold in chemist shops without question, prescribed for coughs, fevers, and even the quiet despair that many women carried without ever naming aloud. Clara remembered the first time she had been offered it. The winter had been sharp, her youngest ill with a fever that would not break. The chemist, kind-faced and brisk, had handed her a small bottle with instructions so simple she could still hear them. A few drops in warm tea, and rest would come. It had worked, not only for her child, but for her too. The ache behind her eyes softened, the nights grew less harsh, and for a brief while, the days felt manageable again. But seasons passed, and the bottle did not leave her shelf. What began as a remedy for crisis had become a quiet, almost unquestioned habit. She was not alone in this. Across the city, women of every station were making similar bargains. Some, like Mrs. Hollings, wore their tiredness openly, speaking of their medicine with a kind of weary pride. Others hid it, tucking bottles behind jars of sugar, pretending the drops in their tea were nothing more than habit. Margaret Penwell's letters had stopped entirely now. Clara had not seen her in months, though she lived only a short carriage ride away. Annie Green, the young girl from the docks, was said to have missed 2 days of work at the factory, her foreman muttering about weak constitutions and unreliable girls. The pattern was forming, even if no one yet spoke of it plainly. Meanwhile, Mr. Hargreaves continued his quiet work. He walked the streets with his notebook, his collar turned against the chill, his mind full of names and dates that no one else seemed eager to hear. He had spoken with more doctors now, some willing to share their concerns, others shrugging him off with polite indifference. Women are prone to nerves, one physician had said, closing his ledger with a soft snap. Better they sleep than suffer. But Mr. Hargreaves could not shake the look in the eyes of those he had met. Young mothers with pale cheeks, widows with trembling hands, girls whose laughter had faded before their youth had even begun. There were whispers of reform, faint as the breeze along the Thames. A journalist had written a series of short columns hinting at the scale of the trade, and a few reformers had gathered to discuss the matter in dimly lit rooms over weak tea. But their voices were small compared to the clatter of carriages, the promises of trade, the coins that passed across chemist counters each day. For Clara, the conflict was quieter, more personal. She had begun to measure her days by the space between each visit to the shelf. There were good days, when the sewing went quickly, the children were lively, and her chest felt clear enough that she thought she could manage without it. There were other days, heavy as the damp air that clung to the river, when her hands trembled and her mind would not rest. Those days always ended the same way, with a teacup held close to her lips, the bitter taste spreading across her tongue. She tried not to think of what it meant or what it might become. Instead, she thought of her children's school fees, of the patch on her husband's coat that needed mending, of the spring washing that never seemed to dry in this weather. Life left little room for reflection when each day asked so much of her. Still, the unease grew. In the market, two women whispered over their baskets about a neighbor who had taken too much and never woke. At the chapel, the vicar spoke gently of moderation in all things, his words careful, but his gaze lingering on a few familiar faces. Even the chemist had begun to look over his shoulder more often, his once brisk assurances now delivered with a hint of caution. Business was good, but questions had a way of gathering like rain clouds. One night, as the city settled into its uneasy sleep, Clara stood at the window again, the lamplight catching her profile in the glass. She could see her own reflection superimposed over the street. A thin figure, shoulders stooped slightly, eyes tired but still searching. Down the lane, a cart rumbled past, its wheels leaving wet tracks in the cobbles. Somewhere beyond, a bell told the hour. She thought of the chemist, of the young reformer whose name she had only heard in passing, of the women whose fates seemed to drift closer to her own with each passing season. Was this how it began for them, too? A few drops, a little rest, a promise that tomorrow would be easier, and then? She did not know. The bottle on the shelf seemed to glow faintly in the firelight behind her. The mystery of it all was not in the bottle itself. It was in the silence that surrounded it. How had so many come to rely on something spoken of so little? How had an entire city learned to live with the soft shadow of its presence, as though it were part of the weather, inevitable and beyond question? Clara did not have the answers. She only knew that each day felt a little more like a choice and a little less like freedom. The tension between what was known and what was said stretched across the city like a quiet thread. Men in Parliament debated figures that never reached the newspapers. Merchants smiled at their profits. Mothers whispered to one another at the market. And in houses like Clara's, the nights grew long, the fires burned low, and the bottles waited. The river carried on, its slow current reflecting the flicker of gas lamps along the banks. Ships arrived, ships departed. Somewhere far away, the fields that grew the poppies swayed under a different sky, their fate tied to women who would never see them. London did not stop for such thoughts. It rarely did. But beneath the surface, the questions were spreading, and the answers were not yet ready to be spoken aloud. The next morning began with a gray light that crept slowly across the narrow lanes, revealing the same cobblestones now slick with mist. Ada's feet ached from the night before, but she forced herself to keep walking. Each step echoed faintly, as if the streets themselves remembered the footsteps of countless others who had passed this way. There was no luxury of lingering. She had promised to check on Clara, a seamstress who had been coughing more often lately, her fingers trembling as she threaded her needles. Clara had been given a small bottle of laudanum by a kind-faced chemist who claimed it would calm her lungs and steady her nerves. It had worked for a time, but now the bottle was always empty too soon, and Clara's cough sounded deeper. Ada knocked on the thin wooden door and heard a faint voice invite her in. Clara was sitting by a small window, her shawl wrapped tight despite the heavy air. The bottle stood on the table beside her, a pale amber liquid clinging to the glass. She smiled weakly and spoke of better days, but her words drifted into pauses, her gaze turning distant as though she were staring through the walls. Ada sat with her, asking how she had slept, whether she had eaten. Clara shrugged. "It helps me work, Ada," she said softly. Without it, the nights stretched too long. Ada wanted to tell her to stop, to throw the bottle away. Yet how could she? The factory demanded 12 hours of stitching. The rent collector demanded his due, and the streets outside offered no warmth. The city's whispers grew louder as weeks passed. Women like Clara, maids, seamstresses, widows, visited chemists more often. They were given tinctures to soothe toothaches, to quiet crying infants, to help them rest after hard days of washing and mending. But in quiet moments, Ada noticed how their faces paled, how their hands grew shaky, how their words became uncertain. She began to wonder whether this was relief or something else wearing a different mask. There were rumors of entire streets where mothers rocked their children beside empty bottles, their sewing left undone. The men who passed through spoke of politics, trade, and ships arriving from faraway ports, but rarely mentioned the women bent over their work tables, fighting invisible battles in their own rooms. One evening, Ada walked home with a candle wrapped against the breeze. The gas lamps along the road flickered dimly, leaving long shadows stretching over the cobbles. A group of dock workers were unloading crates at the end of the lane, their voices low, glancing often toward the darkened warehouses. The word opium reached her ears again, carried by the wind between their mutterings. She slowed her steps, her mind turning over what she had heard weeks before from her neighbor, that the same substance sold in the chemist's bottles arrived on these docks in far heavier loads, destined for parlors far wealthier than her own street. As she passed the corner, a small hand tugged at her skirt. It was a boy no older than 10, barefoot, his hair matted from the fog. "Miss Ada," he said, "did you see my mum? She went to the apothecary and didn't come back." His voice held a strange mixture of fear and expectation, as if this question had become his nightly ritual. Ada knelt, smoothing his sleeve. She promised to ask around, though in her heart she feared the answer. She had seen too many women vanish behind curtained doors, their days swallowed by that same syrupy comfort. In the following days, the market buzzed with unease. A doctor from the north had written a letter to the papers, warning that the city was drowning in a quiet storm. He spoke of laudanum bottles lined up like soldiers on a mantle, of mothers too weary to lift their heads, of factories that turn a blind eye as long as work continued. Ada read the paper under a flickering street lamp, her fingers cold despite the summer air. The words did not scream or accuse. They simply described what was already there, as if the city itself had grown used to breathing that heavy air. Clara's health worsened. Her fingers no longer danced across the thread, but trembled even when still. Ada visited her again, bringing a loaf of bread and a cup of warm tea. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes rimmed red. "I tried to stop," she whispered, "but then the nights came again. They're too long, Ada, too quiet." Her words lingered in the cramped room, echoing a fear Ada could not shake. It wasn't only Clara. There were others, each with their own bottle, each with their own reason to keep drinking. The streets began to change too. Chemist shops stayed open later, their shelves stocked with bottles promising relief, rest, and calm. Behind their counters, men in polished waistcoats spoke of science and trade, of the empire's far-reaching hands, never of the women who lingered on the threshold with coins pressed tightly in their palms. And yet, in the evenings, the same streets filled with murmurs about missing wages, about children crying at empty tables, about dreams fading behind closed curtains. Ada started keeping a small notebook, tucking it under her mattress when she slept. She wrote down names, small details: Clara, the boy at the dock, Mrs. Weaver who once sang by the laundry, but now rarely left her chair. It was not meant to be a list of accusations, only a map of the slow dimming she saw around her. She wondered if anyone else noticed, or if the city preferred to look away. One night, a knock came at her door. It was heavy, hurried. She opened it to find the same boy again, his face pale in the gaslight. "Mum's worse," he whispered. "She won't wake up." The bottle was gone from his hand, but the smell lingered in his clothes, sweet and sharp at once. Ada followed him through the maze of streets, past closed shutters and dripping gutters, until they reached a room where the air felt heavy and still. The woman lay on a narrow bed, her breathing shallow, the curtains drawn. A bottle lay tipped on the floor. Ada felt something cold settle in her chest. She sent the boy to fetch help, but he only looked at her with wide eyes. "Who will come?" he asked. It was a fair question. The night swallowed their voices, the city carried on, and in the distance the sound of hooves clattered faintly, like an indifferent echo. The fog thickened in the days that followed, curling between alleyways, clinging to the river. Ada could no longer tell whether it was the season or something else seeping into every stone and beam of the city. The chemists still sold their bottles. The docks still unloaded their crates. Women still whispered in doorways about their restless nights. Yet beneath it all, a sense of something spreading, quietly, invisibly, grew stronger. She began to walk different routes home, listening for the same word that had followed her for months: opium. It was never shouted, always passed in murmurs. The more she listened, the more it seemed to be everywhere, in parlors, in tenements, in the sighs of mothers and the restless cries of infants. And as the lamps burned low one evening, Ada realized that the city she thought she knew had shifted, its streets hiding more than just fog. There was one place she had not yet dared to go, a warehouse by the river, where men carried crates with foreign stamps and kept their conversations clipped and quiet. She had passed it many times, each time walking faster. But that night, with her notebook heavy in her pocket and Clara's face still pale in her memory, she stopped. The doors were shut, but light spilled through a crack in the frame. Inside, faint laughter drifted, and the smell, sweet, cloying, hung in the air. Ada pressed her ear to the wood. She could hear the rustle of paper, the scrape of crates being shifted, a man's voice saying something about shipments and supplies. Then footsteps moved closer, and she stepped back quickly into the shadows. The door creaked. A figure stepped out, scanning the street with narrowed eyes. Ada held her breath, heart pounding, until the figure turned and disappeared into the mist. Only then did she dare to move, her fingers tightening around the notebook in her pocket. She knew now there was more to this than small bottles and sleepless nights. There was a trail, one that began in the ruins of women like Clara and wound its way to places where the lamps burned brighter and the stakes were far higher. The question was how far she was willing to follow it, and whether the city would let her. The days in London blurred together as the damp air of the city settled over the narrow streets like a curtain that never lifted. Hannah walked slowly down the cobbled path one cold morning, her scarf pulled tightly around her neck. She noticed the way people avoided looking one another in the eye, as though they all carried a secret they were too tired to share. At the corner, the apothecary's shop stood quietly, its window half fogged from the warmth inside. It was the same place she had seen several women leaving in the past week, their faces pale but strangely content. She wondered again what was being sold so freely that it drew them back day after day. Inside, rows of glass bottles lined the shelves, their labels written in careful script. Laudanum, tinctures, tonics, all seemed to promise relief from pain or sleepless nights. The shopkeeper was a man with soft hands and a calm voice, the kind that could convince someone to trust him without much effort. Hannah didn't buy anything that day. She only observed, making a mental note of how easily such substances found their way into homes across the city. She remembered her neighbor, Mrs. Collins, who had once been lively and talkative, but now spent her evenings sitting silently by her window, a bottle always close to her side. At home, Hannah tried to write down her thoughts. She had begun keeping a small notebook, not for anyone else to read, but for herself to make sense of what she saw. Her sister, Margaret, came in quietly, carrying a basket of laundry. "You're thinking about it again, aren't you?" Margaret said softly. Hannah nodded. "I can't help it," she replied. "There's something happening here, something people don't want to talk about. It's like a shadow creeping over the city." Margaret sighed and set the basket down. She was younger, but the hard winters had already etched fine lines on her face. "You can't change the world, Hannah. People have their troubles, and they find their own ways to ease them. Maybe it's not our place to interfere." Hannah wanted to agree, but the unease in her chest told her otherwise. She had seen too many women, too many mothers, slipping into that same dull state. It wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was about escape. The streets that winter were cruel. Workhouses filled with the desperate, and the smell of smoke and coal clung to every coat. One evening, Hannah visited a friend who worked as a maid in a wealthier part of town. The drawing rooms there were warmer and the conversations livelier. Yet even in those well-lit spaces, she saw the same glint of glass on side tables, bottles of laudanum, casually left out as though they were no more dangerous than tea. Her friend whispered that the lady of the house rarely slept without it, and that many of her friends did the same. It seemed this quiet epidemic did not respect the lines between rich and poor. As the months passed, the whispers grew louder. Some doctors began to speak cautiously about overuse, but many still prescribed the opium mixtures freely, claiming them to be safe when taken as directed. For mothers battling sleepless infants, for women weighed down by daily aches and worries, the bottle promised a rare moment of stillness. Yet the cost of that stillness was not spoken of, at least not openly. Hannah found herself torn between anger and sorrow. She wanted to shout in the streets, to warn them all, but she knew the city would only look back at her with tired eyes and keep walking. There was a sense that London itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to give. Men on the docks whispered of ships arriving with more goods from the east, carrying the same substance that was now quietly woven into so many lives. It was hard to tell whether the city was feeding on it or whether it was feeding on the city. One rainy afternoon, Hannah overheard a conversation between two women outside the bakery. They spoke of a young mother down the lane who had grown ill after relying too heavily on her doctor's prescription. Their voices were low, almost ashamed, as if even speaking of it might bring some misfortune upon them. Hannah listened, heart tightening, but they quickly fell silent when they noticed her nearby. It was clear. People knew, yet chose not to know. Margaret, meanwhile, began to worry about their own mother, who often complained of restless nights and had started visiting the apothecary more often than before. Hannah confronted her gently, asking what the bottles were for, but their mother only smiled wearily. "Just for the nerves, dear. The doctor says it's harmless if I take only a little." That word, harmless, echoed in Hannah's mind long after the conversation ended. The city's heartbeat grew louder in the evenings, with gas lamps flickering and horses' hooves echoing on wet stones. Hannah often walked home late, her eyes catching the glow of windows where silhouettes moved slowly, sometimes not at all. She began to feel as if London was falling into a quiet spell, a soft fog not only on the streets, but on the minds of its women. Then, one evening, she saw something that unsettled her deeply. A young woman, no older than Margaret, was standing at the edge of the Thames, staring blankly at the water below. Her posture was still, too still. Hannah approached, calling out softly, and the woman startled, as if waking from a dream. She clutched a small brown bottle in her hand, slipped it quickly into her coat, and walked away without a word. Hannah stood there long after she was gone, the cold wind biting her cheeks. Back at home, the fire had nearly gone out, and the quiet pressed in on her. She knew she was only beginning to understand the edges of what was happening. There were stories behind each closed door, bottles hidden in cupboards and drawers, a silence that felt almost deliberate. It wasn't just about medicine or sleep. It was about something deeper, a need to escape a life that offered little rest, little comfort, and even less choice. The next morning, Hannah decided she would start asking more questions. Not loudly, not in a way that would draw unwanted attention, but quietly among neighbors, in markets, in waiting rooms. She wanted to know how far the shadow reached. And as the city awoke under the pale winter sun, she felt the weight of that decision settle over her. Somewhere in London, more women were stepping into the same fog, and the question that lingered was how many would find their way back. The nights in Victorian London grew colder as the weeks passed, and the city's streets whispered of hidden struggles that many chose not to see. Ellen's small pharmacy became a quiet meeting place for whispers, a refuge for those who wanted to speak but feared judgment. Women came in twos or threes, their faces veiled, their hands clasping small purses that held secrets. They shared their stories in fragments, how the powders at first helped them sleep, how the laudanum soothed their nerves, how they feared waking up without it. These were not loud confessions, but small, trembling admissions, spoken in the safety of shadowed corners. And as Ellen listened, she began to realize how deep the roots of this quiet epidemic had grown. One rainy evening, a figure entered the shop with a deliberate stillness. Mrs. Hawthorne, the widow from High Street, stood beneath her dripping umbrella, her eyes fixed on the shelves behind Ellen. She did not ask for anything, only watched as if weighing her words. "My sister," she finally said, her voice barely above the sound of the rain outside, "has not been herself. She grows pale, forgetful, and trembles when the bottle runs low. I fear what she is becoming." Her eyes searched Ellen's, and there was a silent plea there, not for medicine, but for answers. Ellen offered her a seat by the fire, and as the night pressed in around them, the two women spoke in soft tones about a city that seemed to be unraveling thread by thread. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms lit by gaslight, polite society spoke of progress and empire, of railways stretching across continents and ships bringing tea from distant ports. Few mentioned the bottles that sat quietly on mantels or in bedside drawers, their labels faded, but their contents potent. Doctors assured their patients that it was safe when taken properly, a blessing for headaches, for sleepless nights, for the worries that kept mothers awake. But the whispers in the streets told another story, of women who could no longer keep their homes in order, of children left crying while their mothers drifted in a haze, of debts piling up for bottles they could not seem to go without. Henry, the young reporter with ink-stained fingers, returned to Ellen's shop more often now. He brought her small notes, scraps of observations he had gathered from the streets and hospitals. "There are more of them than we thought," he said one evening, laying a page on her counter. "Nurses in the charity wards speak of women who come in weak and trembling, only to leave with their purses lighter and their needs unanswered. They do not come to be cured, they come to hide." He looked at Ellen then, his brow furrowed. "It is not only the poor, you know. Some of the names I hear belong to women who dine with the mayor." The tension in the city was not loud, not yet. It moved quietly, like mist over the Thames, creeping into homes and hearts without drawing much notice. In the markets, traders wrapped their goods as the evening bell rang. In the alleyways, children played until the lamplighters came. Life went on, but beneath it, there was a thread of unease. People began to wonder what lay behind closed curtains and drawn blinds. The word opium was not always spoken aloud, but its presence was felt in the hurried steps of those who sought it, and in the weary eyes of those who wished they could stop. Ellen found herself torn between her duty as a healer and her growing fear of what the powders and tinctures were doing. She began to measure her stock more carefully, to ask questions where once she would have only nodded. Some customers noticed and frowned. Others thanked her with a trembling hand. One young woman, barely older than 20, broke down in tears at the counter. "I never meant for it to be like this," she whispered. "It started with the pain, and now I don't know who I am without it." Ellen wanted to comfort her, to promise her there was a way back, but the words caught in her throat. She had seen too many others like her, each carrying their own silent burden. Henry's investigation took him to places where the city's polish faded, the damp corners of the East End, the back doors of apothecaries who sold more than they declared, the parlors where women gathered not for tea, but for a small measure of relief. He spoke to a midwife who admitted she carried tinctures for mothers who could not sleep after childbirth. He spoke to a laundress who confessed that the only way she could keep working through the night was with a dose from a friend. Each story added to the weight he carried, and each one led him back to the same question. How had something meant to soothe turned into a chain that bound so many? There were rumors, too, that something larger was at play. Ships arriving from distant shores, carrying crates marked as medicine. Merchants who made quiet fortunes while their neighbors sank deeper into dependence. Henry began to suspect that this was not just a matter of individual weakness or bad fortune. There were hands moving the levers of this trade, hands that preferred the city to remain quiet, drowsy, unquestioning. The nights grew longer, and with them, the unease. Ellen started keeping a journal, noting each strange request, each whispered confession. It was her way of making sense of what she was seeing, though she knew not where it would lead. One entry spoke of a woman who had once been a singer in the music halls, her voice praised across London. Now, she came each week for a small bottle, her hands shaking too much to hold a note. Another entry described a mother who brought her sick child, not for medicine, but for advice on how to stop herself from taking what she had once needed for pain. And still the city turned. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, the markets bustled with trade, the theaters lit their lamps. But in the quiet hours behind closed doors, something was building. The women who gathered at Ellen's shop began to exchange looks, to share not just their worries but their fears. Some spoke of sleepless nights filled with strange dreams, others of debts they could not explain. Henry noticed the same pattern in the stories he collected, a slow unraveling, a creeping dependence that left its mark not only on bodies but on homes, on families, on the rhythm of the city itself. One night, as fog curled low over the streets, Henry found a slip of paper tucked beneath his door. It was unsigned, written in a hurried hand. If you wish to see how deep it goes, it read, follow the carts that leave the docks at dawn. He showed it to Ellen the next day, his expression unreadable. I don't know who sent it, he said, but I think they want this story to be told. Ellen felt a chill at his words. There was danger in following threads that others wished to keep hidden. But there was danger, too, in looking away. She thought of the faces of the women who came to her, mothers, daughters, sisters, and she wondered how many more there were, hidden in the folds of this restless city. As dawn broke over London, the carts would soon begin to roll, their wheels wet with mist. Somewhere in their crates lay part of the answer, perhaps even the beginning of something much darker than either of them had dared to imagine. The weeks in that dimly lit quarter passed slowly, each day blending into the next like a mist that never lifted. The streets carried the same stale chill, the same pale light that filtered through the smog, and yet the whispers about the opium trade grew louder. Mary continued her rounds, offering her small comforts, bits of bread, a kind word, a blanket here and there, but she felt more like a bystander than a savior. There was something shifting beneath the surface, something that went beyond poverty and hunger. The women she once knew to be lively and sharp had grown distant, their eyes glazed, their words slow. It wasn't just the pipe. It was something in the air, in the way the city itself seemed to lean closer, waiting for something to give. One evening, as she helped Sarah down the narrow steps to the courtyard, the girl clutched Mary's arm with unusual force. "He's coming again," she murmured, her voice almost lost beneath the rattle of the passing carts. Mary frowned. "Oh," she asked, but Sarah only shook her head. "The man with the cane. He leaves the parcels. He says we mustn't speak of him." Mary had heard of him before, always from the shadows of conversations, a figure who slipped in and out of the fog, leaving behind small packets that seemed harmless until the women opened them. Sometimes it was tea, other times wrapped powder, always enough to keep them quiet a little longer. The city's newspapers began to take notice, though not in the way Mary had hoped. They wrote of the opium epidemic as if it were a passing trend, something that belonged to the sailors and the poor, a vice tucked neatly away from polite society. But Mary had seen the same hollow look in the eyes of women who once served tea in well-lit parlors. The divide between rich and poor seemed to vanish at the edge of the pipe, and the shame of it made the whispers sharper. The term opium dens filled the columns, and the blame was tossed about like scraps to a dog. Few dared to ask why it had taken hold so deeply, or who was quietly profiting from its spread. Meanwhile, the alley behind the textile mill saw a new kind of visitor. Men in dark coats, their collars turned high, came at odd hours. They didn't stay long, only exchanged words with the doorman and left, their boots leaving damp prints on the stone. Mary tried to follow one once, but he disappeared into the fog before she could catch the glint of his face. Rumors said some were officials, others merchants, and some neither, but something in between, carrying letters from faraway ports, letters sealed with stamps she did not recognize. The women whispered that the parcels were not gifts at all, but chains, light as air at first, and then heavier than iron. Sarah grew quieter as the days went on. Her cough returned, and her steps faltered. Mary wanted to take her away, to the countryside where the air was clean and the nights were dark with stars. But she knew such a dream was far away. The city had its hold, and the hold was not only on the body but on the mind. One night, Sarah pressed a small slip of paper into Mary's palm. "Keep it," she whispered. "If I can't speak again, show this to someone." It was a name, hastily written, along with a street Mary had never heard of. The letters were smudged, but she folded it carefully and tucked it in her sleeve. In another part of the city, a different kind of story was unfolding. Clara, the laundress with calloused hands and sharp eyes, had started keeping notes. She worked long hours near the docks, where crates from the east were unloaded under the watchful gaze of men who never smiled. She noticed how some crates bore markings not listed on the ledgers, how they disappeared before the sunrise shift. She had lost 2 friends to the dens in Limehouse, and swore she would not lose another without knowing why. Clara had no family to warn, no fortune to protect, but a stubbornness that kept her awake long after the fires died down. The women began to gather in quiet corners, away from the prying ears of the men who ran the warehouses and the inspectors who rarely stepped beyond the main streets. They shared names, fragments of routes, whispers of bribes passed in the night. There was talk of ships docking under false registries, of medicines mixed with something more potent sold to mothers who thought they were buying comfort for their sick children. The story was larger than any of them, and yet it lived in their rooms, their beds, their aching bones. Mary, Clara, and a handful of others decided to meet one cold Sunday, their breath visible in the narrow passage behind the church. They spoke in hushed tones, not of rebellion, but of questions. Why was the pipe so cheap when bread was dear? Why did the constables turn their gaze elsewhere when the dens filled? Why did the same doctor who scolded them for their weakness write prescriptions for wealthy women under another name? The questions lingered like the fog, thick and cold, offering no answer but demanding to be asked again. The city at night seemed to listen, as though its brick walls and cobbled streets had heard it all before. The gaslights flickered, casting long shadows that merged with the mist. Somewhere a bell tolled the hour, its chimes swallowed by the damp air. Mary clutched her coat tighter and felt the paper slip still in her sleeve. She thought of Sarah, pale as the linen she once washed, and of Clara's sharp eyes fixed on the harbor. She thought of the man with the cane and the crates and the names that did not appear in any book. Winter deepened, and with it the quiet desperation of the city. The opium epidemic was no longer whispered about in certain streets. It was spoken openly in the wash-houses and the markets, and yet nothing seemed to change. A mother in the bread line would shake her head and say, "It's the way things are," and an old sailor at the tavern would mutter about distant wars and merchants' pockets. The women bore the weight of it in their bodies, their voices, their fading laughter. There came a night when Mary returned to the mill yard and found Sarah missing. Her blanket lay folded by the steps, damp from the evening frost. No one had seen her leave, though the boy at the coal house swore he heard carriage wheels in the lane. Mary's heart raced as she searched the corners, the sheds, the empty stalls, calling her name under her breath. She thought of the paper slip, the name, and the street, and felt a cold resolve settle in her chest. Someone was moving them like pieces on a board, and Sarah had been taken as quietly as smoke. Clara, upon hearing the news, clenched her fists and said nothing. She tore a page from her notebook and scrawled a few lines, then folded it into her boot. "We'll find her," she said, her voice flat, though her eyes were aflame. The others nodded, but their faces carried the same weary doubt. Finding someone in that city was like chasing a shadow through the fog. Possible, but only if the shadow wanted to be found. As the nights stretched longer and the lamps flickered dim, a new fear began to creep in among the women. It was no longer only the pipe they feared, but the hands that delivered it, the wheels that turned at midnight, the whispers that silenced their names. They kept their children closer, their coins hidden, their secrets tighter than ever. Mary walked the streets with her shawl drawn high and her thoughts in a tangle, the name in her sleeve like a thorn against her skin. Something was coming. She felt it in the way the wind cut through the alleys, in the way the church bells sounded hollow, in the way the men in dark coats lingered a little too long near the water's edge. The city was not only sick, it was restless, and the women who lived within it were caught in a web they could not yet see the shape of. The night when the answers would come was not yet there, but its shadow had already begun to stretch across the cobblestones. As winter's chill deepened over Victorian London, the nights seemed to stretch longer, the lamps along the cobbled streets casting thin yellow circles that barely pierced the dark. Amelia walked with her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, the cold air sharp on her face. Yet her thoughts wandered to what she had overheard at the market that morning. A neighbor whispered about a new shipment of opium arriving in the East End, carried quietly through the docks before dawn. No one spoke openly about it, but its presence was felt, especially among the women, whose lives were growing more entangled with its shadow each week. Mary, once a bright seamstress known for her quick hands and sharper wit, had grown pale. Her fingers trembled when she tried to thread her needle, and her eyes carried a distant, unfocused look that was hard to ignore. Amelia had visited her often, bringing bread or warm broth, only to find the air in her small room heavy with a strange scent. It was not just poverty that held Mary down. It was something more insidious, something that crept into her days and nights alike. Amelia wondered if the whispers about opium were not only true, but already close to home. Across the city, in the dim offices of a modest printing shop, Samuel adjusted his spectacles and frowned at the latest reports that crossed his desk. The editor of a small but determined newspaper, he had been trying for months to shed light on the growing problem that no one dared to name outright. He received letters, some from grieving mothers, others from desperate wives, each telling stories of women who had fallen silent or slipped away from their homes entirely. Samuel had been trained to look for patterns, and the same words repeated again and again: sleeping drops, soothing syrups, quieting powders. They were sold openly in shops, labeled as remedies for coughs or for restlessness. But the heart of the matter was clear. They contained the very substance the city pretended to control. One cold afternoon, Samuel met with Amelia in a tea house tucked between two busy lanes. They had known each other since childhood, but now their conversations carried a different weight. Amelia, with her gentle manners and careful eyes, shared what she had seen among the women in her neighborhood. She spoke of Mary, of the sudden quiet in homes once filled with chatter, of mothers who no longer sang to their children but sat silently by the fire as though waiting for the world to change without them. Samuel listened, his pen tapping against his notebook, the words forming faster than he could write. He knew the paper would not print everything he wished to say. Too much truth risked too much trouble. But the story needed to be told, somehow. Meanwhile, far from the tea house, a different kind of conversation unfolded in the polished corridors of a merchant's office near the river. Men in dark coats and stiff collars spoke in low tones about trade, about supply, about keeping up with demand. Opium, for them, was less a danger and more a ledger line, a source of steady profit in a city where poverty was plentiful and suffering was cheap. They used careful words and never spoke of the women who took their wares home in small bottles. To them, it was commerce. To others, it was survival. The streets of Victorian London reflected this unspoken battle. Children darted between horse carts, their cheeks red with cold, their pockets often empty. Women stood outside apothecaries, clutching coins, their faces turned away as though ashamed to be seen. And the docks, those endless, echoing docks, remained the quiet heart of it all, where crates were unloaded by lamplight and men kept their eyes on their work, never asking too many questions. Among them, a few suspected more than they said, watching the flow of goods that seemed to grow heavier with each passing week. Amelia could not shake the sense that time was pressing on her. She found herself walking further each day, peering into the narrow lanes where whispers seemed thickest. She began speaking with other women, some older, some younger, their stories painting a picture that chilled her. One spoke of her sister who had been given a bottle to help her sleep after childbirth and now could barely rise from her bed. Another, a widow who worked as a washerwoman, said the same drops dulled her pain when her back ached, but they left her dreaming too long, forgetting to tend the fire until her cottage filled with smoke. Each story was a thread, and Amelia felt them weaving into something she could not yet see in full. Samuel, meanwhile, faced his own obstacles. His editor warned him to tread carefully. Merchants held influence, and too much truth could close the doors of the paper entirely. Yet Samuel's sense of duty gnawed at him. Each night he returned to his cramped office, lit only by a single oil lamp, and read through the letters again, underlining names, dates, places. He kept them in a locked drawer, not because they were secret, but because they felt dangerous, evidence of a problem no one wished to confront. What neither Amelia nor Samuel knew was that their paths were moving closer to a meeting point that could change everything. There were others, too, who moved in the margins of this story. A midwife who had seen too many infants born weak, a doctor with a conscience heavy enough to speak in hushed tones, a constable who suspected the shipments at the docks were not all as they appeared. Each played a small part, each held a piece of the truth, but the whole picture remained hidden beneath the noise of daily life. As winter gave way to early spring, the city shifted slightly, but the tension did not ease. The fog still rolled in from the Thames, thick and unwelcoming. The lamps still flickered in the narrow streets where Amelia walked, her shawl growing thinner by the day. She thought often of Mary, of the hollow look in her eyes, and wondered how many more women bore that same look in homes just like hers. The city was full of stories, and this one was growing larger, heavier, impossible to ignore. Then one evening, a letter arrived for Samuel, slipped under the door of his office after he had locked up for the night. There was no name, only a few hurried lines written in an uneven hand. It spoke of a warehouse near the docks, of a shipment arriving before dawn, of crates labeled as tea, but carrying something else entirely. The letter ended with a warning, "Do not come alone." Samuel read it 3 times, his breath clouding in the cold room, the ink smudging slightly where his fingers pressed. He thought of Amelia, of her quiet determination, of the women whose names filled his notes. He knew this was the kind of lead that could either open a door or close one forever. And so, as the lamps burned low and the river whispered in the dark, the threads of their stories drew tighter. The city, with all its noise and movement, seemed to hold its breath. Something was coming, something hidden beneath the crates, behind the shop counters, in the very air they breathed. Amelia did not yet know how far she would go. Samuel did not yet know how much he would risk. But both felt it, the sense that this was only the beginning, and the truth was waiting, somewhere in the fog, to be found. The nights in London seemed to stretch longer as winter took hold, and with each passing day, the stories of the opium epidemic reached new corners of the city. Amelia and Margaret continued their visits to the poorer districts, though each time they stepped out, they felt the creeping danger around them. There were whispers now that certain people were watching, following them from the moment they left their homes to the hours when they returned. Margaret had seen a man standing near the same lamppost 2 nights in a row, his hat pulled low, his coat collar raised against the cold. When she approached him, he simply melted away into the shadows, leaving behind the faint scent of smoke and a quiet echo of his boots on the cobblestones. The streets told their own stories. Posters appeared on brick walls, warning of the dangers of addiction, but no one seemed to take them seriously. The opium dens remained busy, their curtains drawn tight to hide the dim glow inside. Women who once spoke openly about their struggles began to retreat into silence, afraid of what might happen if they were seen talking to the wrong people. Amelia sensed this fear everywhere she went, on the faces of mothers clutching their children, in the hurried steps of women avoiding familiar alleys, in the cautious way they spoke of the men who supplied them. One evening, Amelia and Margaret were invited to a gathering hosted by a group of reformers. determined to expose the scale of the problem. The event was held in an old hall on the edge of Soho, where gaslights flickered and the air carried the smell of damp wood. People from different walks of life gathered there. Writers, doctors, merchants, and a few who had once suffered at the hands of the epidemic themselves. A thin man with weary eyes told the story of his sister, who had begun taking laudanum for her headaches and never stopped. A former shopkeeper described how his wife had pawned their belongings to buy the liquid that promised her relief. Each tale was a thread in a larger tapestry of quiet suffering that had become almost invisible in the city's noisy streets. Margaret listened closely, jotting down names, dates, and details in her notebook. Amelia, meanwhile, was drawn to a woman sitting alone at the back of the hall. Her shawl was pulled tightly around her shoulders, and her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her tea. When Amelia approached, the woman introduced herself as Clara. She spoke in a low voice, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might overhear. Clara claimed she had once worked in one of the dens, serving drinks and cleaning rooms. She told Amelia about the hidden passages that ran between some of the buildings, how the dens connected to each other in ways that allowed their owners to escape should the authorities ever decide to raid them. Clara's story added weight to what Amelia had begun to suspect. The epidemic was not just the result of chance or fashion, but a carefully managed network that reached deep into the city structure. Someone, or perhaps several people, stood to profit from keeping women dependent, and they were willing to go to great lengths to keep it that way. Outside the hall, the fog was thicker than usual, swirling in slow patterns beneath the gaslights. The streets were quieter too, as though London itself was holding its breath. Margaret tucked her arm through Amelia's as they walked, both aware of the sound of footsteps behind them. When they turned, the street was empty. Only the fog moved, yet the sense of being followed clung to them all the way home. The following week, a name began to circulate among the reformers: Lord Harrow. He was said to have investments in shipping and trade, but there were rumors, and proven, whispered only in private, that his ships carried more than just tea and cloth. Some believed he was one of the invisible hands feeding the city's habit, using his influence to keep questions from being asked. Amelia wanted to believe this was just another story, the kind people told to give a face to something as vast as the epidemic. But when she mentioned his name in certain company, conversation stopped. I shifted to the door. People changed the subject. Margaret proposed they try a different approach. Instead of speaking directly to the women who used opium, they would talk to those around them. The shopkeepers who sold them their groceries, the neighbors who noticed when they disappeared for hours, the coachmen who carried them to places they refused to name. It was a slow process, one that required patience and a careful choice of words. Many were reluctant to talk. Some feared for their safety, others simply wanted to keep their heads down. As the days passed, their search began to reveal patterns. Certain streets in Whitechapel saw more women coming and going at odd hours. In Lambeth, a small group of apothecaries all stocked the same imported tincture, labeled with unfamiliar marks. And in a quiet row of houses near the Thames, they heard of gatherings where well-dressed gentlemen and weary mothers sat side by side, passing the same pipe beneath heavy curtains. The more they uncovered, the more the city seemed to close around them. Notes were left under their door with no signature, warning them to leave things alone. One evening, they returned home to find a letter pushed halfway through the mail slot, its paper damp from the rain. Inside, in hurried script, were the words, "You do not understand what you are touching." It was unsigned like all the others, but the ink was still wet. Margaret argued they should slow down, take a step back, perhaps share what they had found with someone in authority. But Amelia felt the opposite pull. The warnings, the shadows, the silence, they all pointed to something larger, something that wanted to stay hidden. She could not stop now. Not when the faces of the women they had met lingered in her mind. Not when she thought of the children left behind in cold rooms while their mothers sought relief. Winter deepened, and with it, the city streets became harsher. Ice clung to the edges of the river. Horses left dark marks in the snow. And somewhere in the midst of it all, the epidemic continued, quiet but unrelenting. Each night, new lights flickered behind drawn curtains. Each morning, more lives bore the weight of something they could not easily name. One night, Amelia was returning from a meeting when she saw a familiar figure at the edge of the fog. It was the same man Margaret had noticed weeks before, the one who always seemed to vanish when approached. This time, he did not move away. He tipped his hat, his face shadowed, and murmured something she could not quite hear before disappearing once more into the narrow lanes. His presence was brief, but the unease it left behind stayed long after. The story was far from finished. If anything, it was only beginning to show its true shape. And as Amelia and Margaret sat by the fire, their notes spread across the table, they knew that the threads they were pulling it could either reveal the truth or lead them somewhere far darker than either of them had imagined. The fog had thickened in the streets of Victorian London, curling around the gas lamps like a restless ghost, hiding more than it revealed. Each step taken by those who still wandered at this hour sounded hollow against the damp cobblestones, as if the city itself held its breath. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Rumors about the opium epidemic no longer stayed in the opium dens. They spilled into parlors, markets, and alleyways. People began to wonder, who was truly behind it? Was it just the merchants and chemists who sold their tinctures and powders, or was there a deeper hand steering the flow of this addiction? Women had become both the visible sufferers and the silent witnesses, their lives unraveling under the weight of something most could barely name. Emma found herself unable to sleep that night. The lamplight in her small room flickered weakly as she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with the memory of the woman in the apothecary who had clutched the laudanum bottle like it was the last piece of her soul. She thought of the letters she had read, the ones describing women lost in a haze, their families falling apart, their children left to wander hungry. She thought of the whispers of wealthy households in Belgravia, where the same tinctures were sipped behind velvet curtains without shame, the same poison dressed in elegance. The city was living two lives, one desperate and exposed, the other hidden beneath lace and polished brass. Outside, a carriage rumbled by, and with it came the faint echo of hurried voices. Somewhere in Whitechapel, a group of men had begun meeting regularly at a coffee house to discuss what they called the trade problem. They claimed to be philanthropists and reformers, eager to cleanse the city of its filth, but their eyes betrayed ambition more than compassion. They saw opportunity where others saw ruin. If the epidemic could be controlled, it could also be redirected. And if certain people disappeared from the streets, if certain voices grew quiet, perhaps their plans would face less resistance. Meanwhile, in the west end of the city, a physician by the name of Dr. Whitaker was keeping notes no one else had seen. His practice had grown strangely profitable in the past 2 years, though not from treating the healthy. Women came to him in secret, some too frail to speak, some barely able to stand. They sought relief, but what he offered was a cycle that never ended. He told them it was for their nerves, their sleeplessness, their sadness, their delicate constitution, and they believed him because they wanted to believe something. He knew better. Each prescription was a thread tied to something much larger, something he had begun to fear he could no longer escape. In another part of London, in a damp boarding house, Margaret sat by the window and held a letter in her hands. Her sister, once bright and filled with life, had not written in months. The last letter spoke of strange dreams, of a medicine prescribed for her headaches, of a life that was slipping away piece by piece. Margaret had promised her mother she would find her, but each inquiry led to another closed door, another polite refusal, another shopkeeper who suddenly forgot her sister's name. It was as if the city itself was conspiring to erase her. As the nights passed, the line between sickness and dependency grew thinner. Apothecaries were visited at dawn and dusk, their counters worn smooth by desperate hands. Some women had begun to barter heirlooms for bottles. Others had started pawning their clothes. A child had been found asleep in the corner of a shop, his mother unconscious beside him, a spilled bottle soaking into her skirts. The newspapers reported it with a single column of print, buried near the bottom of the page, as if it were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. Emma, determined to uncover what was happening, began keeping her own notebook. She wrote down names, addresses, and snippets of conversation overheard in the markets. She knew there was danger in prying too deeply, but she could no longer look away. Her work had taken her to places most women would not dare to go, from the dark lanes of Limehouse to the polished streets near Kensington, where curtains were drawn and secrets were well kept. Each step made her feel both closer to the truth and further from safety. The city seemed to breathe differently now. It had a pulse, slow and heavy, marked by the soft chink of bottles against shelves and the rustle of coins passed across counters. Behind the haze of respectability, something older and more ruthless thrived. Some said it was the traders who brought their goods from far-off lands. Others whispered about politicians who turned their eyes away in exchange for favors. But the women, those who used, those who suffered, those who watched, knew it was never so simple. It was a web, and each strand led to another. One evening, as the rain tapped steadily against the windows, Emma received a folded note slipped beneath her door. It was unsigned, the handwriting neat but hurried. It warned her to stop asking questions, to stop visiting the chemists after dark, to stop speaking with the women in the alleyway near the docks. It ended with a line that chilled her more than any cold wind. "You are closer than you think." She read it twice, then tucked it in her notebook, her hand trembling only slightly. The next day, Margaret arrived at her door, her face pale, her eyes sharp with worry. She had heard of Emma's inquiries and came seeking help. Her sister, she said, had last been seen near a particular apothecary on Fleet Street, one that had grown infamous among the poor for its willingness to sell on credit. She begged Emma to come with her, to see if they could trace her steps. Emma hesitated, not out of fear, but because something about the timing felt too convenient. Yet how could she refuse? One more name, one more story. It might be the piece she was missing. As the two women walked together that gray morning, the city seemed to watch them. A man lingered too long by the corner. A carriage slowed when it passed them, and a boy no older than 12 followed them for 3 streets before vanishing into an alley. It was as though invisible hands were already marking their path. Somewhere, a decision had been made. How much they knew, how far they had gone, and how quickly they could be silenced if necessary. When they finally reached Fleet Street, the shop stood quiet, its windows clouded, its door ajar. Inside, the air smelled faintly sweet, with a bitterness that lingered in the throat. The apothecary was empty, or seemed to be, until a voice came from the back. A man's voice, calm and slow. He emerged with a polite smile and asked if he might help them. His eyes, however, flicked quickly to the notebook in Emma's hand, and in that brief glance, she felt the weight of something much larger than a simple shopkeeper. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady. London continued on as it always did, the horses clattering, the fog rolling, the secrets deepening. Somewhere, a clock struck noon, and with it, the sense that the city was about to shift. The epidemic was no longer just a matter of tinctures and bottles. It was a current pulling them all closer to something dark and inevitable, and none of them, Emma, Margaret, the women in the alleys, the men in the coffee houses, knew how deep it would go before the surface finally broke. The nights grew heavier as the city seemed to hold its breath, and the fog that once rolled in quietly now clung to the streets like an unwanted guest. Eliza found herself walking home later than usual, her steps echoing against the damp cobblestones. Each flickering lamp threw long, wavering shadows that made the narrow lanes feel alive. Her thoughts were a jumble of worry and resolve, tangled like the twisting alleys she passed through. More women were missing, more whispers were surfacing, and yet there was no sign of a real investigation. The opium epidemic was becoming something more than a silent poison. It was a web that stretched from the poorest quarters to the polished offices of men in power. In the dimly lit parlor of her home, the fire had died to a faint glow. Mary was already asleep in the next room, her breathing uneven but steady. Eliza sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea, staring at the notes she had scribbled earlier. The names of missing women, the addresses of the opium dens, the suspicious pharmacy receipts. It was all there, scattered like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. She thought of the women she had spoken to, their hollow eyes and weary faces, each telling the same story in different words. There was always a man in the shadows, always a promise of relief, always the same slow descent. The streets outside carried the distant sound of a carriage, then the abrupt call of a night watchman. Eliza felt a prickle at the back of her neck, as though someone had been watching her all the way home. The feeling hadn't left her since she began digging deeper, since she had dared to ask questions that respectable women were not supposed to ask. The pharmacist's reaction earlier that week still troubled her. His sudden defensiveness, the way he lowered his voice when mentioning certain names. What was he afraid of? Or rather, who was he afraid of? Across town, Dr. Howard Langley closed the door of his office with a soft but deliberate click. His assistant had long gone, leaving only the faint scent of laudanum and ink. Papers were stacked neatly on his desk, but one letter lay open, its edges curled slightly from the damp air. It was written in a hurried hand, urging him to stop attending the gatherings near Whitechapel. They were drawing attention, the letter warned. Too many questions were being asked by those who had no business knowing the answers. He folded it carefully and slid it into the drawer, but his thoughts lingered. There was too much at stake to turn away now. At the docks, another shipment arrived under the cover of darkness. The crates were labeled with vague markings, their contents declared as harmless trade goods. But the men unloading them knew better. They moved swiftly, their breath forming pale clouds in the cold night, their eyes darting to the corners where shadows shifted. Somewhere behind the rows of warehouses, a figure watched them silently, making note of the route they took and the men they met. Back in the heart of the city, conversations carried on in drawing rooms and smoke-filled clubs, where gentlemen leaned back in leather chairs and spoke in hushed tones about progress, trade, and the city's future. Few mentioned the epidemic by name, but it lingered there, a stain in the background of their prosperity. One of them, a man with a sharp jaw and colder eyes, toyed with his pocket watch as he listened to the talk. He had investments in the trade that no one openly named, and every delay in the city's response worked in his favor. Eliza's growing determination was not unnoticed. Letters began arriving at her door, and signed, vague warnings written in uneven script. Some begged her to stop for her own safety. Others hinted that she was closer to the truth than she realized. One night, she found a folded note slipped beneath her window. There are names you do not yet know, and places you should not go. Leave it now, or you will not return the same. She held that note for a long while, the candlelight trembling as the wick burned low. Did it frighten her? Perhaps. But more than that, it confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This was not only about addiction or neglect. Someone, somewhere, had a reason to keep this trade alive, and they were willing to go to great lengths to protect it. Meanwhile, Mary's condition wavered between fragile calm and restless nights. The tea she drank was no longer enough to soothe her, and Eliza feared the creeping hold of the very substance she was trying to fight. The apothecaries offered little help, their shelves stacked with bottles that promised rest but delivered chains instead. One kind old physician suggested sending Mary away to the countryside, where the air was clean and the nights were quiet, but Eliza knew distance alone would not cure the root of the sickness. In the corners of the city, where the fog lingered longest, the women gathered quietly, sharing what little they had. Some had lost children to the streets, others husbands to the same vice they now endured alone. There was a sense of waiting among them, as though they knew something was coming, a reckoning, perhaps, or a collapse. Their voices, once soft and resigned, began to carry a note of warning when Eliza visited. "Be careful where you walk," one whispered. "There are men who do not like your questions." The tension grew as winter crept closer. The nights stretched longer, the lamps seemed dimmer, and the streets less forgiving. The epidemic was no longer whispered only in hushed corners. It was written on the faces of the poor, etched into the silence of homes like Eliza's. And yet, the city turned as it always did. Carriages rolled past, shopkeepers polished their windows, gentlemen raised their glasses in warm parlors. Life went on, as it often does, with shadows deepening behind it. One cold evening, as Eliza prepared to visit a woman who claimed to have information about the shipments at the docks, she felt that same prickle of being followed. The street was empty save for the sweep of a lamplighter, his ladder creaking as he moved from post to post. She quickened her pace, clutching the folded notes in her pocket, her breath visible in the frosty air. The meeting place was a narrow alley near the river, where the fog rolled thick and the stones were slick with mist. She hesitated at the entrance, scanning the dim outlines ahead. A figure stepped forward, not the one she expected. His hat brim cast a shadow over his face, and his voice was calm but edged with warning. "You've been asking the wrong people the right questions," he said, "and that makes you dangerous." Eliza steadied her voice, though her pulse quickened. "Then tell me the right ones." For a long moment, he said nothing, only glanced over his shoulder as if measuring the darkness behind him. Finally, he spoke again, lower now. "There are places in this city that thrive because no one dares to name them. Keep pressing, and they will name you instead." She wanted to ask more, but footsteps echoed from the far end of the alley, and when she turned back, he was gone. Only the fog remained, curling around the stones like a living thing. The paper she carried felt heavier that night, the city's weight pressing closer with each step home. Something was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the letters, in the restless streets. But what it was, and how deep it ran, was still just out of reach. The streets of Victorian London had begun to feel like a living, breathing thing, one that watched, waited, and whispered in the dark. Margaret found herself walking through Whitechapel late one evening, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders as the mist rolled low over the cobblestones. The city seemed quieter than usual, though she knew it was never truly silent. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage wheel rattled over uneven stones, a dog barked, and the faint hum of a tavern door opening spilled a tune into the night before vanishing again. Yet there was something else beneath it all, a low hum of unease that had begun to wrap itself around the neighborhoods like a tightening thread. She had left Edith's home only an hour earlier, both of them sitting in near darkness, speaking in low voices while Edith clutched her cup of tea with trembling hands. Edith had confessed more about her late husband, about the money he had left behind, and about the man who came to collect a fee for the opium deliveries. He was a shadowy figure who never gave his real name, but the others in the street called him Mr. Carrick. He was said to have friends in high places, men who sat in warm parlors while the poor wrestled with cold and sickness. Margaret had written his name in her small notebook, underlining it twice. As she reached the corner of Bishopsgate, she noticed the narrow alley where a group of women huddled under the overhang of a shop that had long since closed. They were young, some barely older than children, yet their faces carried the hollow look of women twice their age. One of them glanced up at her, her eyes dull but curious. Margaret offered a faint smile, but the girl turned away quickly, pulling her thin shawl closer. They had the same marks Edith had spoken of, the sleepless eyes, the shallow breathing, the restless hands that couldn't stay still. It was as though the entire street had fallen under the same shadow. The growing whispers about the epidemic were starting to reach the drawing rooms of the wealthier neighborhoods, though in a different tone. There, it was described as an unfortunate trend among the working class, a weakness of their nature, something to be pitied but not confronted directly. The same drug that was poured into their tonics and teas, prescribed by their physicians for nerves or women's troubles, was treated as a mild indulgence when used behind lace curtains. Yet here, in the worn-out streets, it was a chain that dragged mothers from their children and left men staring blankly into the fire, too weak to rise. Margaret had been keeping her notes carefully, writing late into the night by candlelight. Each page was a quiet rebellion against the silence that seemed to stretch across the city. She was beginning to see connections forming, names repeated, locations that kept appearing, and merchants who profited without ever showing their faces on these streets. There was a warehouse mentioned twice, near the docks, where crates were unloaded at odd hours. She wasn't yet brave enough to go there alone, but the thought of it lingered at the edge of her mind, like a cold draft creeping under a locked door. Across town, another story was unfolding in a cramped room above a bakery. A man named Thomas Hargrove, once a dock worker, now spent most of his evenings nursing his wife, who had taken to opium after their youngest had passed from illness. She had been given the tincture by a local doctor to ease her grief. At first, it dulled the edges of her sorrow, but soon it became the only thing that held her upright. Thomas, a man of quiet strength, was now the keeper of a secret he could not share. If he spoke too loudly, the doctor would say it was a private matter. If he kept silent, he feared he would lose his wife entirely. He had seen her fade over the past year, her laughter gone, her hands trembling even when the room was warm. Meanwhile, whispers reached the back rooms of small apothecaries. Clerks counted bottles late at night, always a few more than they sold by day, always a ledger that never quite matched the truth. There were shipments arriving from faraway places, marked with false names and innocent labels, spices, herbal remedies, imported tonics. The river was their ally, carrying secrets beneath the fog. For every open bottle in a respectable household, there were dozens hidden in cellars, waiting to be carried down these narrow streets where no one asked questions. Margaret could not yet piece it all together, but she felt the weight of something larger than herself pressing at the edges of her investigation. There were names she dared not say aloud, families who profited quietly, and women like Edith who were left to pick up the pieces. Each conversation added another thread, and the tapestry it wove was darker than she expected. On one of her late walks, she paused near the gaslight outside a small church. The priest there, Father Whitby, had seen her notebook and asked gently what she was doing. She hesitated before telling him, and he listened with a grave expression. He had seen many funerals lately, too many small coffins carried down the steps by weary fathers, too many mothers staring blankly at the altar as though nothing in the world could reach them. He told her there were rumors among the dock workers about a shipment coming soon, larger than any before. If that was true, the streets were about to drown under the weight of it. There was a sense of urgency creeping into her days now. Every hour that passed felt like a page turning towards something she could not yet see. The city had its rhythms, the clatter of the market at dawn, the clink of glasses in smoky taverns, the distant cry of newsboys shouting about parliament debates and railway schedules. But beneath it all, there was a quiet pulse of something spreading, like roots under a cobbled road, breaking it apart one stone at a time. She met a woman named Harriet at the soup kitchen one evening, a seamstress with threadbare gloves and sharp eyes. Harriet spoke plainly. She had lost two sisters to the same medicine that was sold as a comfort for women. One of them had gone to a private clinic, paid dearly, and come home with a small bottle. She never quite came back from it. Harriet wanted to speak, but no one wanted to hear. People were afraid of losing what little help they had, afraid of men in long coats who seemed to know everyone's names, afraid of the silence that followed anyone who asked too many questions. Margaret promised Harriet she would write her story. It felt like a small promise, almost fragile, but it was a start. She carried these stories like small, flickering lanterns, each one lighting a corner of the dark. Yet the dark always pressed back. As the autumn deepened, the city grew colder, and so did the people's patience. Riots were whispered about in taverns. Women began to gather in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what had been taken from them. Men muttered over pints about the merchants who grew richer as their families withered. And somewhere, in a grand office lined with mahogany, someone signed a paper authorizing another shipment to the docks. Margaret stood by the window that night, her notebook open but her pen still. She stared out at the gaslit street, wondering how much of the city was already lost. Somewhere out there, Mr. Carrick was moving his pieces. Somewhere, another bottle was being poured, another family about to be broken. And tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to follow the rumor of that shipment or to stay silent and safe. Would the streets let her choose? Or had the city already decided for her? The town seemed to hold its breath as night fell, an almost eerie stillness wrapping around its streets. The investigation had reached a point where everyone felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on them. The team had been following leads that seemed promising at first, but each one either led them in circles or ended abruptly, without clear explanation. The pieces were scattered, and yet there was a growing sense that something much bigger was unfolding just beyond their reach. People who had once been confident in their stories were now reluctant to speak. A few even claimed they had seen or heard things they could not explain, only to later change their statements when asked again. It was as if someone or something was quietly pulling at the strings in the background. Rebecca sat at her desk late into the night, the dim glow of the lamp highlighting the growing fatigue in her eyes. The documents before her painted a picture of events that should have been unrelated, yet the patterns were undeniable. Navarro had been out all day, retracing steps in the outskirts, talking to individuals who rarely set foot in the town anymore. They were both feeling the pressure of time slipping away. The unease of knowing the truth was closer than ever, but still shielded by layers they hadn't yet peeled back. There were whispers about a second layer of involvement, one that nobody had dared to mention openly. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the history the town had buried and the people willing to keep it that way. The second twist came quietly at first, like a shadow slipping across a dimly lit room. A single name surfaced in a conversation Navarro had with an old mechanic near the rail yard, a name that had appeared before in unrelated notes and forgotten testimonies. The man claimed he had once delivered something for that person late at night, years ago, but the way his hands trembled when he spoke said more than his words. When Navarro pressed further, the mechanic suddenly grew quiet, muttering that he had said too much already. It was a thin thread, but it was enough to make them dig deeper. That name linked to a property on the edge of town, long abandoned, at least according to public records, but strange reports suggested otherwise. Rebecca and Navarro decided to visit the property the following day. The road leading there was unkempt, overgrown in parts, as though time itself had tried to erase it. But as they drew closer, it became clear that someone had been there recently. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, faint but visible, told them they weren't the only ones interested in this place. The air felt heavier as they stepped out, the kind of stillness that makes even the rustling of leaves seem deliberate. The building was an old warehouse, its walls weathered, its windows covered from the inside. No sign of life, and yet there was a faint hum, barely audible, like a generator or something mechanical, still running deep within. As they circled the building, they noticed a small hatch partially hidden beneath debris. Navarro carefully moved the broken wood aside, revealing a metal door with a new lock, one far too modern for such an old place. This was no abandoned property. Someone had gone through great effort to keep it looking forgotten while maintaining access. They exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that they were on the edge of something much bigger than what they had started with. The lock was beyond what they could bypass right there and then, but the discovery alone added a new layer of urgency to their investigation. The town's past began to unravel as they dug deeper into archives and off-the-record conversations. The person whose name had surfaced was once connected to several influential figures, people who had either moved away suddenly or faded into quiet obscurity. There were documents that hinted at covert meetings, unexplained financial transfers, and a string of unsolved incidents that spanned decades. Each thread they pulled seemed to tighten the knot rather than loosen it. The case they thought was confined to a few individuals now appeared to be part of a much older, more complex web. The people they had trusted for answers were either withholding information or too afraid to share it. Meanwhile, small but alarming changes began to ripple through the town. Surveillance cameras that had been inactive suddenly started working again. Certain streets seemed to have more unmarked vehicles passing by at odd hours. Navarro noticed he was being followed at least once, always at a distance, never close enough to confront, but close enough to make it clear they were being watched. Rebecca received an anonymous message one evening, a single line, "Stop digging, or you'll find more than you want." It didn't shake her resolve, but did make her more cautious. Tension among the locals grew as well. Some began to openly question the sudden resurgence of interest in old stories, while others quietly urged them to keep going, believing that the truth had been hidden for far too long. It was clear the stakes were no longer just about solving a mystery. They were about exposing something that had been kept in the dark deliberately, perhaps for generations. The property on the edge of town became a point of obsession for Rebecca and Navarro. They returned several times, always finding it untouched, yet subtly altered, as if someone was aware of their visits and wanted to remind them they were always a step behind. The second plot twist revealed itself fully when they uncovered a series of coded notes hidden in a set of archived town ledgers. They weren't supposed to have access to those files. Someone had gone to great lengths to restrict them, but an old archivist, tired of the silence, had quietly left them out during their visit. The codes referred to shipments and movements of items that were never officially recorded, and at least one of those dates matched the night the mechanic had mentioned. This wasn't just about one person or one incident. It was about a network possibly still active, using the town as a front for something far more significant. The realization was a double-edged sword. They were getting closer to the truth, but with that closeness came a sharper sense of danger. Every step forward now felt like walking a thin line. They began to notice patterns in the warnings, subtle shifts meant to intimidate rather than attack directly. Locks tampered with, files that disappeared after they viewed them, calls that ended in static when they tried to confirm information. It was becoming clear that their investigation was pushing against forces that had the means and the will to keep things hidden. As the days stretched on, the lines between ally and adversary blurred. People they had counted on for support began to hesitate, claiming they had families to think of, businesses to protect. A few brave souls continued to share what they knew, but even they urged caution, their voices lowered, their eyes darting to unseen watchers. The warehouse remained locked, a silent sentinel on the outskirts, and they knew that whatever lay inside might be the key to everything, or the start of something far worse. The rain had slowed to a faint drizzle by the time the clock neared midnight, but the tension in the small town hadn't eased. The streets were unusually quiet, almost expectant, as if the very air sensed something was about to happen. Inside the modest police station, the glow of desk lamps cast long shadows across the walls. Files were scattered, half-read, half-forgotten, as the officers wrestled with the weight of the day's discoveries. Each piece of information seemed to lead somewhere dark, yet never fully revealed the truth. Whispers moved between them, fragments of doubt, theories that didn't align, and questions no one dared voice too loudly. One officer, who had kept mostly silent until now, finally spoke up. His voice was low but steady. What if we've been looking at this the wrong way? What if this isn't about what happened yesterday, or even last week? What if this has been going on for much longer under our noses? His words hung heavy in the air, drawing the eyes of his colleagues. For a moment, no one replied. It wasn't the theory itself that rattled them. It was the way he said it, with the kind of quiet certainty that made denial impossible. Elsewhere, in a dimly lit cafe that stayed open late for locals who didn't like going home early, a small group of townspeople gathered. They spoke in hushed tones, passing along bits of what they'd heard, each adding their own interpretation. Some believed the recent string of strange events was a coincidence. Others were certain it was connected to something much larger. Among them sat an older woman who had lived in the town her whole life. She stirred her coffee slowly, eyes distant, before finally saying, "I've seen patterns like this before years ago. People forget, but the past doesn't always stay buried." The table fell silent, the chatter fading as they realized her words might hold more truth than speculation. Meanwhile, back at the edge of town, a figure moved quietly through the night, careful not to draw attention. They carried something wrapped in an old cloth, holding it close, as if both burdened and protected by its weight. Each step was deliberate, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few working street lamps. This figure wasn't running away, at least not in the traditional sense. They were moving with purpose towards something, or perhaps away from what was about to unfold. As the night stretched on, Tension rippled through places that had once felt ordinary. The quiet library where the town records were kept, the narrow alleyways where whispers seemed to echo, the old warehouse by the tracks that hadn't been used for years but somehow still smelled faintly of fresh paint. These places were no longer just backdrops. They were pieces of a puzzle, each carrying a clue that no one had fully pieced together yet. At the heart of it all were the people, ordinary on the surface, yet each holding a fragment of the story. A shopkeeper who noticed strangers asking too many questions. A bus driver who swore he saw someone familiar at a time they shouldn't have been there. A student who stumbled upon a message scribbled in a library book that seemed out of place, almost like a warning. Their lives, once separate, now felt like threads being drawn together, tightening around something hidden. In the midst of these quiet revelations, another discovery emerged. A document, old and faded, tucked away in a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. It wasn't the document itself that caused the room to still. It was the name scrawled at the bottom, a name that tied the present to an incident long considered resolved. But the details didn't match. The dates were wrong. The signatures didn't align. It was as if someone had tried to rewrite what happened, and not very carefully. This revelation sent ripples through the few who saw it. If it was true, it meant that the story everyone believed might have been built on a false foundation. But saying that aloud, accusing those who had written the history, carried its own risks. No one wanted to be the first to speak it plainly. Yet they all felt it, a shift, a crack in the ground beneath their feet. As the night inched closer to dawn, the pieces continued to align in unsettling ways. Conversations that once felt harmless now carried a weight of hidden meaning. A phone call that had gone unanswered suddenly seemed intentional. An empty chair at the community hall took on a new kind of significance. People began to wonder if the truth had been there all along, not in the shadows, but hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when too many eyes would finally notice. Somewhere in the town, a clock struck 3, the chime echoing faintly through the damp air. For those awake, it wasn't just another hour passing. It was a reminder that time was running out. Whatever had been set in motion was nearing its peak. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the sparse light. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged, like the pause before a storm finally breaks. And in that silence, a decision was being made. Someone, somewhere, chose not to stay still any longer. Their hand hovered over a phone, their finger traced the edge of a key, their breath caught in their throat. What they were about to do would not undo what had already been set in motion, but it would tip the balance, one way or another. The night stretched deep into silence as the investigation reached its breaking point. Navarro stood in the dimly lit hallway, his fingers trembling slightly as he clutched the folder that held the final pieces of the puzzle. Rebecca was a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the closed door ahead of them. Behind that door was the man they had been chasing for months, the one who had set everything in motion, weaving lies and truths so tightly that even the most seasoned agents questioned what was real anymore. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had been lost and everything that was about to change. Neither of them spoke, but they both knew this moment would decide everything. When the door opened, the room inside revealed a scene that neither expected. Jeremy, the man they thought they were hunting, was already there, seated at a table with a calmness that felt almost unnatural. His hands were flat on the surface, and there was no trace of fear in his eyes. He didn't look like a fugitive cornered by the FBI. He looked like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. "You came sooner than I thought," he said softly, his voice carrying an eerie steadiness. Rebecca exchanged a quick glance with Navarro, her instincts screaming that something was still wrong. They had been led here, guided even, and the unsettling realization sank in. This had all been part of his plan. Jeremy spoke in a way that made the room feel colder. He revealed how every step of their chase, every lead they followed, was part of a larger design meant to expose someone else, someone within their own ranks. Navarro's hands clenched at his side, his thoughts racing as pieces started to connect. The double cross, the false trails, the subtle hints of betrayal. It wasn't just about Jeremy. It was about who had been protecting him and why. Rebecca tried to steady her breath, knowing the next few seconds could either break the case or destroy everything they had worked for. Then the unexpected twist hit them like a sudden storm. Jeremy wasn't the mastermind. He was the bait. The true architect of the chaos stepped out from the shadows behind him, a face they both knew, someone they had trusted within the investigation from the beginning. The room seemed to shrink as this person stepped closer, their expression calm, almost satisfied. It wasn't anger that filled Rebecca. It was a hollow kind of shock, the kind that comes from realizing the betrayal had always been close, hidden behind friendly words and well-placed concern. Navarro felt it too, the betrayal cutting deeper than any wound the case had left. What followed was a tense exchange that unfolded like a blade slowly being drawn. The betrayer spoke of deals made in the dark, of truths hidden to protect power and control. Every revelation was another thread pulling the fabric of their understanding apart. Jeremy had been promised protection, a way out, if he played his role perfectly. And he had. He had lured them here, but not to escape. Instead, to deliver them to the one who had orchestrated everything from the inside. It was a gamble, one meant to silence them forever or force them into submission. Rebecca moved first, not with violence, but with words that cut through the rising tension. She called out the betrayer's name, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. She laid bare the evidence they had gathered, the connections they had found, and the witnesses who had already begun to talk. Navarro followed, his presence a wall between Jeremy and the one who had set this trap. The room became a battlefield of truths and threats, every word carrying weight, every second edging closer to an outcome no one could fully predict. The climax wasn't a loud explosion, but a sudden, sharp turn. Jeremy, the bait who had once seemed untouchable, turned on his handler in a final, desperate act of survival. He revealed documents, recordings, and secret deals hidden in plain sight. The betrayer's face shifted from calm control to something else. Fear mixed with anger. The look of someone whose carefully built empire was crumbling in real time. Agents moved in, the door bursting open with reinforcements ready, and in that chaotic moment, lines were drawn, sides were chosen, and the truth finally came to light. But even as the room filled with agents and the betrayer was taken into custody, there was no sense of victory. Rebecca looked at Navarro, both of them knowing this was not the end. There were still questions left unanswered. How deep did this network run? Who also played a part in the shadows? And what would become of Jeremy now that he had exposed everything? The twist had shifted the board, but the game was far from over. As they left the room, the hallway felt colder than before, the air sharp with the weight of what had just happened. The climax had revealed the truth, but it also uncovered something far more dangerous. A system willing to protect its own secrets at any cost. Rebecca knew they had won a battle tonight, but the war was still out there, waiting in the dark. And somewhere, in the cracks of that silence, another story was already beginning to unfold. The air felt lighter now, though the echoes of what had happened still lingered in the minds of everyone who had been part of this tangled story. The tension that had gripped the town was slowly unwinding, replaced by a quiet sense of relief that came after weeks of fear, doubt, and unanswered questions. People began returning to their routines, but there was a shift in the way they looked at one another, an awareness that they had all been through something that would leave a lasting mark. Trust, once shaken, was being rebuilt one cautious conversation at a time. The streets, once shadowed by uncertainty, now felt alive again with simple sounds of life. Doors opening, neighbors talking, children playing at a distance that once felt unsafe. Rebecca walked slowly past the familiar alleyway where it had all started. The memories came back, but they didn't carry the same weight as before. There was still a trace of unease in her chest, yet it was mixed with a strange calm, the kind that only comes after truth has been wrestled out of the dark. Navarro joined her a moment later, carrying the case files they had fought so hard to untangle. "Strange how quiet it is now," he murmured, scanning the area as if expecting a shadow to slip out from behind a wall. She nodded, her eyes tracing the outlines of the buildings. "Quiet doesn't always mean safe," she said, "but it means we made it through." In the days that followed, the community began to piece together the damage left behind by the chaos. People who had been too afraid to speak now stepped forward with fragments of truth, each adding to the mosaic of what had really unfolded. The senator's daughter, once a silent figure in the backdrop of whispered conversations, finally shared her part of the story, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Her courage opened a door for others, and soon, the lies that had been spun so tightly began to unravel fully. Apologies were made, not just in public speeches, but in quiet moments between neighbors who had turned cold in their fear. Healing, it seemed, was a slow but steady process. For the officers who had stood on the wrong side of the line, the consequences were unavoidable. Some were suspended, others dismissed, and a few found themselves facing charges they never imagined would reach them. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability, something the community had been deprived of for far too long. The good officers, those who had chosen to stand up rather than step aside, became symbols of what law enforcement was meant to be. They didn't ask for praise, but they received it anyway, because people finally saw the difference between silence and courage. One afternoon, as the summer air carried the faint scent of rain, a small gathering formed outside the old courthouse. It wasn't an official event, just people coming together to share a moment of acknowledgement. Navarro stood quietly near the edge of the crowd, watching as Rebecca spoke softly to a group of children who had once watched the chaos unfold from their windows. She told them that fear was real, but so was standing up for what was right. Her words were simple, but they carried weight in their honesty. For many, that was the moment when the story shifted from something painful into something worth remembering. The twist that had shaken everything near the end. The revelation that one of the trusted community leaders had been quietly feeding false information to stir fear left a bitter taste. It was hard for people to accept that betrayal often wears a friendly face. Yet in an odd way, it was that very revelation that brought people closer. Knowing the truth, even when it hurt, was better than living with lies that poisoned every glance and conversation. The leader in question faced the public with downcast eyes, their power stripped, their influence gone. They tried to explain, to twist their own story into one of misunderstood intentions. But the community had learned enough to see past the words. With the main conflict behind them, the town found its rhythm again, but it didn't slip back into old habits. Meetings that had once been empty now filled with concerned voices. People who had stayed silent began volunteering for small roles in shaping a better future. It wasn't grand, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. The scars of the past weeks would remain, but they would also serve as reminders of how fragile peace can be and how strong a community becomes when it refuses to let fear divide it. Rebecca and Navarro were called in one last time, not for an interrogation or a heated discussion, but for a quiet meeting in the mayor's office. There was no applause, no ceremony, just a heartfelt thank you for doing what many had been too afraid to do. Sometimes the hardest part, the mayor said, is not the fight itself, but choosing to keep standing when everyone wants to sit down. The two agents exchanged a glance, understanding that their work was done here, at least for now. There would always be another town, another story, another set of secrets waiting to be unearthed. But this one, finally, had found its ending. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and crimson, Rebecca found herself walking the quiet streets once more. The same streets where tension had once crackled now held a quiet hum of life. A shopkeeper closed his doors with a relieved sigh. A mother led her child by the hand, without glancing over her shoulder. A young man stopped to help an elderly neighbor carry groceries inside. These simple acts felt like victories, small, ordinary, but powerful. Navarro joined her again, this time without the heavy files or the weight of decisions pressing down on him. "You think they'll remember all this?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. She smiled faintly. "They will," she replied. "Not every detail, not every name, but they'll remember what it felt like to face it together. He nodded, and for the first time in weeks, his shoulders eased. The story that had started with suspicion, fear, and whispered rumors ended not with fanfare, but with quiet resilience. It showed that even when trust is broken and systems falter, people can still choose to do the right thing. The lesson wasn't wrapped in grand speeches or bold headlines. It was there in the quiet decisions to speak up, to step forward, to hold someone accountable when it would have been easier to look away. As they left the town behind, the agents didn't carry triumph. They carried perspective. Every case, every conflict, was a reminder that justice isn't a single act. It's a series of choices made by ordinary people. And while the names might fade, the impact of those choices would linger in the corners of the town for years to come.